What if I told you that some of the most significant events involving U.S. presidents during the mid-20th century were marked by conspiracies, hidden agendas, and covert operations?
So this Puerto Rican nationalist is living in Manhattan with this woman, and he's not happy about the insurrection and says, we got to do something. That's his partner.
From assassination plots to secret wars, these events changed the course of history. But often, there's more than meets the eye. Today, we're exploring 5 major conspiracies involving U.S. presidents that might make you question what really happened behind closed doors. How much did the public know? And more importantly, how much were they kept in the dark? Let's start with a conspiracy that struck at the heart of the White House itself.
They decide to get on a train in New York and Grand Central Station and go to Washington, D.C. And they get to Washington, D.C. with a plan. And their plan is to assassinate the President of the United States of America, Harry Truman.
Picture this. It's 1950. President Harry S. Truman is living in Blair House while the White House undergoes renovations. Suddenly, the quiet Washington morning is shattered by gunfire, aimed directly at the president. What many don't realize is this wasn't just an isolated attack. It was an assassination attempt by 2 men, Oscar Collazo and Gracilio Torresola, with a clear political motive.
A definite plot to assassinate the President of the United States was foiled today.
Collazo and Torresola were Puerto Rican nationalists who wanted to draw global attention to their movement for Puerto Rico's independence from the U.S. The attack was meticulously planned. On November 1st, 1950, the 2 men approached Blair House with pistols, knowing that this would be the only chance to reach Truman while the White House was closed for repairs. But their plan quickly unraveled thanks to the heroic actions of Truman's guards.
Floyd, you were on the spot. You shot one of these assassins. Tell me just what happened.
One of the men went by our post on the east side of the Blair House, Chief, and when he was about 10 feet away from Officer Birdsell, he pulled his gun and started shooting at the officer. Officer Davidson and I immediately pulled our guns and started shooting.
Gracilio Torresola managed to fatally wound White House police officer Leslie Caulfield, but Caulfield, despite being gravely injured, returned fire and killed Torresola. Meanwhile, Secret Service agents and police subdued Oscar Collazo before he could get close enough to Truman. Here's the thing. Truman was just upstairs at the time. In fact, he briefly looked out the window to see what was happening, unaware that his life was at risk. The assassination attempt was foiled, but it raised troubling questions. Were there other potential threats being covered up? Was the security of the president weaker than the public had been led to believe?
Press photos show Oscar Collazo, one of the killers, now in hospital charged with murder. Torresola, another assailant, was shot dead by the police. And Leslie Caulfield, a police guard who lost his life in defense of the president.
This event is a reminder of how close the president came to being a victim of political violence and has shown a light on political unrest that simmered beneath the surface in U.S. territories like Puerto Rico. Now let's move from assassination to something a bit more covert. In 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act, creating the CIA, an organization that would become one of the most powerful and secretive agencies in U.S. history.
The experiences of the OSS saw the need to create a specialized organization that could handle intelligence gathering and covert operations with plausible deniability. The successor of the OSS, the Central Intelligence Agency, continued that legacy with very mixed and controversial results.
But here's something many people don't realize. Truman wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction the CIA was headed. Initially, it was designed to gather intelligence and serve as a central information hub. What Truman likely didn't anticipate was that the CIA would become an entity that conducted covert operations, some of which would remain hidden from even the president. As the Cold War heated up, the CIA's influence grew, often carrying out operations without full transparency. Could the CIA have been operating beyond Truman's control even from the start? Some argue that the creation of the CIA marked a point where shadowy, unchecked power entered U.S. politics, operating behind the scenes and even influencing presidential decisions. Next up, let's fast forward to 1953 and one of the first major actions by this new CIA, Operation Ajax.
Former Premier Mossadegh's ruined house is a mute testimony to 3 days of bloody rioting, culminating in a military coup from which the one-time dictator of Iran fled for his life.
It was a covert operation orchestrated under President Dwight D. Eisenhower to overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Oil. Mossadegh had nationalized Iran's oil industry, which didn't sit well with British and American oil interests.
One of his rare appearances, Mohammad Mossadegh, Premier of Iran, meets the press to reaffirm his government's unwillingness to arbitrate with Britain over nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. With chances of a settlement fading, the West's best hope is that this sickly man, in whose frail hands may lie the key to peace, is as anti-Russian as he is anti-British.
The UK, along with the US, convinced Eisenhower that Mossadegh was leaning towards communism, even though the evidence was weak. Operation Ajax was launched, and Mossadegh was removed from power in favor of the Shah, who would rule as a pro-Western authoritarian.
His car, as well as his home, is a shambles. In the quick shift of power, Mossadegh was finally apprehended and awaits trial for treason. The Shah, who had fled to Rome, comes home, backed by General Zahedi, military strongman, who engineered his return to power.
This was a turning point. The successful coup became a blueprint for future U.S. operations in foreign countries. But was it really about communism, or was it a cover to protect corporate interests? Critics have long suggested that the U.S. government's involvement in toppling democratically elected leaders wasn't about spreading democracy, it was about securing economic and geopolitical control. Now let's talk about another controversial CIA operation that followed closely behind. Operation PB Success in Guatemala in 1954.
Carrying anti-communist banners, jubilant soldiers celebrate victory following their 2-week revolt in Guatemala. Colonel Carlos Amas, the rebel leader, is embraced by some of his supporters who helped him overthrow the Red regime in Guatemala.
Once again, the Eisenhower administration used the CIA to overthrow a democratically elected leader, this time Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz had introduced land reforms that took unused lands from large corporations like the United Fruit Company and redistributed it to peasants. Sound familiar? Just like Iran, these reforms threatened the U.S. corporate interests, and once again, the specter of communism was raised. Eisenhower and his administration framed Arbenz as a communist threat, and the CIA executed a coup to remove him.
At the presidential palace in San Salvador, behind guarded doors, the rebels and the anti-red military junta ruling the country meet to negotiate peace.
After the coup, Guatemala descended into decades of civil war and violent political instability. But here's the real question. Did the U.S. government prioritize corporate profits over democracy? Operation PB Success suggests that the Cold War provided a convenient cover for protecting business interests under the guise of fighting communism.
No one wants another Pearl Harbor. This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world, especially those capable of massive surprise attack. Secrecy in the Soviet Union makes this essential.
Finally, we come to the U-2 incident, a Cold War scandal that exposed just how far the U.S. would go in its espionage efforts. In 1960, a U.S. U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace.
At his news conference, President Eisenhower defends espionage as brought sharply into focus with the downing of an American U-2 reconnaissance plane over Soviet territory.
At first, the U.S. denied the spying allegations, claiming it was a weather plane. But the Soviets had captured Powers alive, along with the wreckage of the plane. President Eisenhower was left with no choice but to admit the truth. The U.S. had been conducting surveillance flights over the Soviet Union.
As the Secretary of State pointed out in his recent statement, ever since the beginning of my administration, I have issued directives to gather, in every feasible way, the information required to protect the United States and the free world against surprise attack and to enable them to make effective preparations for defense.
The incident was a huge embarrassment for the U.S., and it severely damaged relations with the Soviet Union at a time when Cold War tensions were already high. Here's where the conspiracy theories come in. Some believe that the U-2 flight was deliberately sabotaged. The timing was suspicious, coming just before a major summit between Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The U-2 incident derailed the summit and escalated Cold War tensions. But was that the intention all along? Was there a faction within the U.S. that wanted to prevent peaceful negotiations? Or was it just a case of a covert operation gone horribly wrong? So what do these events reveal about the U.S. presidency during the mid-20th century? They show us that behind the scenes, there were secret agendas, covert operations, and potentially even forces the presidents didn't fully control. Were these decisions made in the name of democracy and freedom, or were they about power, control, and profit? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell.